did you guys notice it? If I'm asking something from the GPT which has happened maybe yesterday or maybe something is happening today, GPT doesn't know about anything related to the latest information. And the reason is that the GPT models are trained till the late 2023. For example, the GPT-3 model is trained till 2021 and the GPT-4o models are trained 2023. So what is the solution for such cases? If I have some application which is built on the top of GPT, that application gives the answers based on my context and my application and business context. But if someone is asking a question related to something happened after the GPT model is trained, GPT doesn't know anything about it. The solution is OpenAI Function Calling, and in this video we will understand OpenAI Function Calling. We'll go through different steps to use OpenAI functions, and then at the end we will build some chat completion using Python and OpenAI function calling to get some real-time data or any data after the GPT model is trained. So let's get started. So first thing is why we use function calling, and as I mentioned earlier that the OpenAI model knowledge is limited to October 2023. This is true for the latest models, the 4o models, and if you are using GPT 3.5, that is even trained before that, and the training date is 2021. The other reason we are using function calling is that to get the latest data. Using the function calling, you can connect your large language model to the external tools. It could be like Wikipedia, it could be some weather API. So now let's try some practical chat completion, whether we will try to implement OpenAI function calling using Python on the top of GPT. The chat completion structure actually remains the same, so you still need to pass your GPT model here, 3.5, 4 or 4 turbo. You still need to pass your messages here, but to change the behavior of the GPT model, instead of responding explicitly that my train date is 2023, we need some way to hook a function or to hook an API with the GPT model. So instead of giving this response, if the GPT model does not know about any query, instead of giving this response, the GPT model will try to call that function which we will pass here alongside the messages. So I'll call it tools equal to suppose functions, and the other thing is tool choice, which could be auto or which could be required also. So what does the auto mean? That whether you want to put it on the GPT model to decide whether I need to call a function for this query, or if you want to make it a required, then the GPT model will explicitly call that function when the GPT model doesn't have an answer for that question and it is required to get that answer from some external function. Tools is actually a list of functions which we are going to define now. So what I'll do is that I'll add another cell above here and I'll add my function snippet here. So instead of tools, I'll call it functions. Function is a Python list and it could include multiple functions. Maybe you want to ask the GPT model related to the weather report, like how was the weather today in London, or the other question could be who won the FIFA football last time. Using multiple functions, you can train your GPT model to behave differently or to call different functions based on what function is more suited for your query. So here I'm defining the type as function, then I'm defining the actual functions, which is a dictionary. So here we don't define the functions as we have like Python functions with the def keyword. Functions are defined by using different parameters, and then we are feeding those parameters to GPT model, and GPT model will automatically call the function based on which parameters you are passing. So here I'm naming this function as get current weather, and then I'm giving a description, get the current weather for a specific location. Then I'm defining the parameters for the function. So this will become like def get current and here we define different parameters. So the parameters here is actually the list of parameters this function is accepting. So the type is object because it's a dictionary, and then we are defining different properties. So the get current weather will accept two parameters. One is location, so about which location we are asking for the weather report, and the location type will be string because we will be passing the city name like San Francisco or London. And the other thing is the unit, since London and San Francisco are using different units for weather report measurement, so we'll call it type string, and the value could be either Celsius or Fahrenheit based on which city we are passing. And here we are passing also the description. So description is optional. This is just to instruct the GPT model what this unit parameter does, and here we instruct the GPT model what the location parameter does, and here we instruct the GPT model what the function actually does. So remember, this is not the actual function, this is just the template for the function which we are going to pass to the GPT model, and based on this function template, GPT model will call you the actual function which we are going to define later to get the actual weather data from the internet. So I've defined functions here, and now I'm passing that same functions here to the tools parameter, and I'm calling this tool choice as auto. So I'll run this cells just to make sure this variable is added to the stack list, and then I'll go back to my chat completion API call, and here I'm setting the function variables by passing to the tool parameters. So let's see what the ChatGPT responds if I'm passing my functions in the form of tools. So here you can see that GPT model has responded the same way, which we have already seen, that it's explicitly responding that I don't have any information about the 2024, and here you can see the function call is none and the tool calls is also none. So now let's try another query and see if the GPT auto calls the function based on the query. So now you can see the message attribute and the content is none. So this means that the GPT did not return any text response the way it does before by mentioning that I don't have any data about this query. And here you can see the function call is none. Under the tool calls attributes, it says that message tool call, and then it's giving some ID, and then it's giving me the function that GPT is going to call this function with arguments location London and the unit is Celsius, and the function name is get current weather. So now I didn't explicitly mention about the unit of the weather report like the Celsius, but the GPT internally identified that since the weather report is about the London, so it set that unit to Celsius. Now if I change this to maybe California, now you can see it's still referring to the function calling, and this time the location is California and the unit is automatically set to Fahrenheit. So now in the previous case when we were asking about the Euro Cup, it was not calling the function, but instead it was returning that it doesn't have any information about 2024. So if I retry that same query, now you can see it's explicitly asking that I do not have any data about 2024, and it's not calling the function. So to change this behavior, this is the reason the GPT API has this tool choice called tool choice, which you can set to auto. So based on this parameter, for the previous query about the weather report, it was automatically referring to the function calling, but in case of the data in 2024, it's not actually referring to the function call, but it explicitly returning that it doesn't have any data about 2024. Now in this case, or in any case, if you want to force the GPT model to call the function each time you are putting any query, you can set the tool choice to required, and now you can see this time it's calling the function automatically. And since this query is not about the weather, it sets just some dummy parameters with the location London and the unit Celsius. And the reason it didn't call the function in case of auto, because we have the function about the weather, but the query is about the Euro Cup 2024. That's the reason it's not referring to the function call, because that function is related to the weather report, but we are asking about some sports. So now let's try writing our actual function. So instead of returning this response as a function call, we'll force GPT to call the actual function and give us the weather report about any city we are passing here. For that, what I'll do is that I'll create another cell right above this chat completion API to define our actual function. So here I have a dummy function which will return us the current weather based on different cities. But in the actual use case, you can replace this function with your actual API call to call any weather API and get the actual report based on your query. But just to save us on time, I'm just defining a dummy function here, and based on any city you are passing, it will return you the weather report for that city. And the other thing I'll need to do is that whenever the GPT model responds that I need to call this function, so instead of getting the actual text response here like message.content, instead of this I'll first try that whether the GPT model wants to call this function or it has a text-based response. So for that I'll write some code here. So what I'm doing here is that I'm first checking like whether the message has the tools calls or not. If you guys have checked here, the response has the tool calls, and if the tool call is not empty, it has a list, then this means that we need to call this actual function with these parameters. So here I'm checking that response.choices.message.tool calls. If tool calls is not empty, then what I'm doing is that I'm defining a dictionary by the name available function, and the function name I have defined when I was passing that function name to the GPT model here in the function, and then I have this function name. So I'm defining that same key here, and then I'm setting the value of that key or that function to the actual function, which is the get weather report. So if you go here is the function get weather report, and it is set based on this function name which we are passing to the GPT model. So now next what I'll do is that I'll move this messages from here to a variable. So I'll call it messages. So here I'm moving these messages to a variable because whenever I get a response from the GPT model, I want to extend that conversation. And the reason is I'm not sending just one message each time to the GPT model, because if I'm sending one message, the GPT will directly check that query in its trained data and it will give me the response. And if I'm sending another query right after that previous query, the GPT model will again check that same query in its trained data, and it will lose the context. So just to keep the context and make the GPT model context aware, and here since we are calling the GPT model 2 times, one time we are calling it for deciding whether the GPT model needs to call a function or it has a text-based response. And if it has a text-based response, then we need to keep that text-based response and also append our next message in the list of those messages to make the whole context, and then pass that whole context to the GPT model, including the previous one which has the function calling, and then the later one where we will be calling the actual function. And we are explicitly instructing the GPT model that now since you have recommended to call the function, now you need to call this function in case you want to call the function. So if you guys see here in the response, it's asking for a function call, but since we are not instructing the GPT model again that okay, if you want to call the function, here is the function, you need to call this function. In this script we are doing exactly the same thing. We are first calling the GPT model. If the GPT model wants to call a function for that query, we are checking it here, and then we are setting that function. We are extending the conversation just to append the message to the context, and then later we are again calling the GPT model with that same list of messages. But here since we have added that new message also here, including the function call by including the function ID, the role is tool. So here you can see the role is changed from the user or the system to tool. Here the GPT model will know that okay, the role is tool, so I need to call a function, and then we are passing the function name and we are also calling the function response. So here I'm extending the messages with the assistance reply, and if you guys see here we have just one function in this tool calls. I'm getting the first element from the list, and then I'll be using this ID and this function arguments. So here I'm getting the function name, you can call it function call or you can call it tools. Then we are getting the function name from the same tool. Let's actually copy this above so we can see it clearly. You guys can see this is the tool call, this whole response. Then the function name is tool call.func.name, and here is the func, and then we have dot name here. And then which function the GPT model will call is that we are getting that function from the available function. So here we have set the function key here, which is the get current weather, and the same function name will be returned by the GPT model as well in its initial response. So here we are getting the current weather and we are getting the actual function from this dictionary of functions. And the same way we are getting the function arguments. So this time this is California and Fahrenheit. If we are calling this next time, it could be London and Celsius. So that's we are getting those arguments dynamically. And since this arguments in the form of JSON object, but it's a string, so to convert this string of JSON to the actual dictionary or the actual JSON, we are calling it with the JSON.loads, and then we are calling the actual function. So function to call, so here is the function to call. This is same as get weather report. So this actually does exactly the same thing, and then we are passing the location and the unit. But instead of calling it this way, maybe in the future we will have more functions and every function should be called dynamically. So that's why we are trying to call that function dynamically by first getting the function here and then calling it here, and then whatever response we are getting from this actual function. So in this case, since we are passing California and we don't have California here, so suppose we'll set it to Tokyo. And now if we are passing this function with the location Tokyo, this function will return this response that location is Tokyo and the temperature is 10 and the unit is whatever unit we have passed here. So here we are doing the same. We are calling this function with the location and unit, and any response we are getting from that function for the location and the unit, we are appending that message response, which is in the form of dictionary, to this messages list which we are going to pass to GPT model. So now to extend the conversation with the GPT model, we are setting the tool ID here. We are setting the rule to tool. So GPT model will explicitly call the function, and what function it will call, this is the function name, and what will be the response of that function, this will be the response. So now next time when you call the GPT model with that query, first it will return us that the GPT model wants to call this function, and then when we process this whole getting function and passing the location, we are setting the messages here, and the GPT model will actually return us this response instead of giving us the tool call function name. So here you guys can see that we are doing everything explicitly. We are getting the function name, we are getting the location and unit, and then we are passing that function, and then even we are getting that function response, and we are passing that function response back to the GPT model. So you guys may be thinking that what is the whole purpose of this function calling if we are doing everything ourselves? So GPT model does not call a function for us. The GPT model doesn't even pass the parameters or even getting the data from the internet. Everything we are doing ourselves internally. The only advantage here is that if you have integrated your GPT model in your application and your application wants to get maybe the real-time data from 3 or 4 different sources, instead of implementing that getting real-time data in a separate module, you can implement that module separately and then you can inject it into your GPT based application. So you don't need to manage things separately and getting response from GPT and GPT doesn't have, then you need to get the response, load your module and do everything yourself there. So this way the only purpose is that you can hook your function to the GPT model. But other than that, everything you need to manage, you need to implement on your own. As you guys can see here, we are calling function, getting the response, and then we are passing that response to the GPT model. So the last response we will be getting from the GPT model, we will just have the same function response. So here I have extended the messages and then we are getting the second response. So I'm calling the GPT model again, and then whatever response I'm getting, I'm printing the actual message. So let's try this and see how it looks. So now you guys can see we have two responses. The first response is the same, that role is user and the content is how is the weather today in Tokyo. If you guys see, we don't have the actual text-based response, but instead OpenAI wants to call this function get current weather, the location is Tokyo and the temperature is 10 and the unit is Celsius. And then when we pass this same function calling to the GPT model here, when we append it here in the messages, the GPT model just give us that same response that the current temperature in Tokyo is 10 degrees Celsius if you see the response here from the actual function, the location is Tokyo, the temperature is 10, and the unit is Celsius. What does the OpenAI do here? That it only combine these list of parameters into just a plain statement, that instead of returning us the JSON based response, it's giving the response that the weather in Tokyo today is 10 degrees Celsius. It's just converting this dictionary of different arguments into a plain English statement. Here you can see the current temperature in Tokyo is 10 degrees Celsius. So the actual response we have given to the GPT model is location Tokyo, temperature 10, and then it's converted that parameter based dictionary into a plain English text, and it gives us that response as the way GPT model responds. So now I can get the actual response here, that message.content. And the reason we are getting two responses, that I'm printing this response here. So if I comment it out here, then you can see that we have the final text response. So this was all about the function calling. So function calling is nothing but implementing your own solution, hooking that solution to the GPT model in the list of your messages. Then what the GPT model will does that at the end it will convert your message to some rewording, or it will just change it from different parameters into a plain statement, and it will give you the response. So just to revise quickly what we did there, we imported the OpenAI library, we instantiated a client here, then we defined our functions here. What our function does it, that it returns the weather report for any city, and it will also dynamically change the weather unit either to Celsius or Fahrenheit, and then we implemented the actual function. So this is for the GPT model. From here it will decide that what is the nature of that function, and this is the actual implementation. So here you can do anything, you can call any external API, you can load data from any function, and then you can return the response in the form of JSON. So here we have different cities, and it's returning different responses based on each city. And here we have the actual implementation. So we have a list of messages where we are asking about the weather today in Tokyo. So let's change it to New York. And here we are calling the GPT model with these messages, and we have set it to auto. So the GPT model will auto decide that whether the function needs to be called or not, and then we are explicitly checking that if the GPT model has decided to call a function, we will set that function into a dictionary. Then we will extend the messages with whatever response we are getting from this API call, and then we are parsing the function to get the actual function name, what arguments the GPT model wants to call, and then we are passing the actual function. Whatever response we are getting, we are appending that response to the messages dictionary, and we are also explicitly instructing the GPT model to set the role to tool, so it will consider this function name and function response as a function call. And lastly, we call the GPT model with that whole set of messages we have set here. So let's retry it. So on the first attempt, the GPT model responded that this function needs to be called with these parameters. One other advantage with this is that the GPT model auto decides the dynamic parameters also, and then we have the final text-based response based on our function call. So in the next video, what we will do is that we will try another GPT model called Dolly, and in the Dolly model we will try to generate some images with different qualities and in different resolution. So we will give a query to the Dolly model, and we will try to see how it generates the images.